Hello, I'm Joseph Kwan, architect, access consultant. I am now living and working in Hong Kong now for the last 30 odd years. I graduated from QIT way back in the 70s in architecture, and I've been working and traveling overseas. And eventually, I'm now back in Hong Kong as an architect. Background, I am now a full-time access consultant. My practice has been running for at least 15 years, whereas I've been working in this area of accessibility for the last 36 years or so. When I left Australia, basically, to go overseas, I got into some postgraduate work first in the UK, eventually worked in London, and afterwards I was fortunate enough to be able to work in France and Paris for 4 years in general architecture. Eventually, I came back to Hong Kong. I worked in a fairly big practice, and afterwards, I got into working for an NGO, the Hong Kong Society for Reputation, who happened to have a unit looking at accessibility in those early days, probably in the 80s. There were hardly any accessibility issues being discussed or experts in Hong Kong to look in this area. So I worked within this NGO for about 18 years, promoting accessibility through to the government, looking at designing and buildings, looking at the design manual, which we basically prepared several of them since then. And about 15 years ago, I started my own practice called UDA Consultants, which is Universal Design and Accessibility Consultants in Hong Kong. So my work is fairly varied. I mean, the public sector side is, of course, advising government and sometimes looking at design manuals, looking at government projects, where as an access consultant architect, how we can input into that part of the built environment. That's the public sector. Private sector, I have a range of different projects as well, from small to large, working with small NGOs, like advising them on designing for homes for the elderly, designing for centers which cater for people with disabilities. That's more the NGO side. Commercial side, little fun projects like designing, advising the Apple Store in Hong Kong in terms of getting good accessibility. You know, the Apple people are very, very good designers. They're very keen in getting what's right, and they don't want too much noise, if you like, in the building, and how to integrate accessibility, you know, without putting in a pretty sometimes unsightly ramp and handrails to comply with local standards. How do you overcome that? So that was a very interesting project for Apple, and also along this very prestigious street called Canton Road in Hong Kong. There are a number of fashion houses. Louis Vuitton was going through a renovation projects, and how do you get accessibility incorporated into a high-end designer store like Louis Vuitton? And the other one was Fendi. Both of these are very similar, in fact, of fashion, clothing, and where the building may have steps, may have different levels, and how do you incorporate that into a fashionable, nice high-end stores without making it look too clinical? There's another area of input, if you like. We need to look at accessible transportation. So to me, it's two major areas: the built environment and accessible transportation, which we as designers, architects, or industrial designers can have an input in making it more accessible, universally free for everybody. Probably 30 years ago, 40 years ago, we would not see a person in a wheelchair in the street in Hong Kong because the streets were not accessible, public transport not accessible. So people say, why are we designing something for very few people? We hardly see them. They don't come out in the streets. They don't use the environment. So that's the thing now. People are coming out and people are respecting that, that people have the equality, the right to be out in the environment, and even have public transportation now. Before 30 years ago, we did not have any low floor, kneeling, wheelchair accessible buses. Now we do. Now in Hong Kong, 100% of our buses are wheelchair accessible. And so they're coming out into the streets and using buses. And people are learning to be more patient. In the 30 years ago, people say, look, this will not work because Hong Kong people are so impatient. They're not going to wait 2 minutes for some person in a wheelchair or in a pram to come in and park themselves. But now I think people are more accepting. They don't mind waiting a few minutes. They accept people with different abilities, disabilities, and now the elderly are coming out a lot more in wheelchairs. And therefore, I think the culture is changing. And finally, just a reminder to everybody here, the few things we need to consider during this work. The United Nations Convention, the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It's got a number of articles. I think article number 3, it talks about definition, and universal design is very much in it already. So it's included in the UN Convention. I think article number 9 talks about accessibility in terms of to the built environment, to the services, and including ICT. I think that's probably the new world, information communication technology, the smart city, the smart world. That's the other thing that we need to look at in terms of building and design. And going back to the motto of to leave no one behind. And the other one concept I believe we're addressing now is a DEA, the disability, equity, inclusion. I think if we have all those in mind, I think we're going to be designing a much better environment, a much better world for the rest of us, for our older generation, and I believe for humanity.